Hello, 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 and welcome to Irreverend, a new episode this week with me, the Reverend Jamie Franklin, and my good friend, as always, the Reverend TJ Pelham. Hello, TJ.
Hello. You should do that in a French accent, a sort of.
Hello,
I
hello,
don't know.
hello.
Hello, hello.
I was going for a Cockney accent.
Were you? Okay, fair enough. Yeah. I mean,
exactly.
you didn't hit one, but
You can imagine how deeply that cuts me, Tom.
It does. I've got a theory. In fact, I made a model, Jamie, recently. I
hope it wasn't a computer model, Tom.
It was a computer model. Yeah.
Oh no.
And I made a model of
a ship.
Looking at. Well, I have made a model of a ship as well. It's a great model. We're doing the rigging and everything with a pair of tweezers. No, I'm serious. It's quite patient. It's quite hard work. I made a model about our podcast, Jamie, which is, you keep claiming that we're going up in ratings, which is great. We're getting lots of feedback. And then last week, the sort of the hammer dropped when you said, do you know, Tom, these days it seems to be you speaking more than me. And I realised that these two things have clear correlation, right? There's nothing to do with lockdown skeptics. It is simply the fact that I'm talking more. Now,
is that the reason we're growing, or is that
the reason we're growing? I think it's going to be exponential, and in a couple of weeks' time, Jamie, we are going to be, up there with Planet Normal. Just as long as you let me speak enough.
Okay, I think
I'll check with Neil Ferguson.
They've got about 10,000% more listeners than us at the moment, so we've got some way to go. It's a lot of talking you're going to have to do.
You just got to wait 2 weeks, Jamie.
Okay. Good. All right. Well, that's great. Well, I'll let you talk as much as possible then, in order to garner those new listeners and viewers. Tom, that's an interesting theory. So, Tom, how are things going for you? You've got a lovely background this week. So, for all our listeners who are not watching on YouTube, it's an etching from your west window.
That's right, at the Church of the Transfiguration. If I duck out of the way, those who are watching can see it is indeed a picture of the Transfiguration. Our west window is etched rather than stained, which is rather nice actually. It's very different. It's had some small. I changed the colours slightly so you can see them well, but I think I rather like standing here. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't put myself in the. Well, I mean, as a minister, I guess we always, and a Christian, we always try and put ourselves in the place of Christ, but not maybe in the Transfiguration.
You're obscuring Christ, though.
I'm obscuring Christ, but I like the idea of having Moses on one shoulder and Elijah on the other, the law and the prophets.
It's lovely, isn't it?
Giving me wisdom.
Well, we need their prayers at the moment, Tom. We really do. You know what, Tom? I watched a really good film the other day.
Did it have any actors in it?
Yeah, I won't bother telling you who they were because I know you don't know any actors. But it's called Greenland. I thought it looked rubbish originally because it has a man called Gerard Butler in it, and Gerard Butler has been in a number of very.
So is that his name in the?
No, in real life, that's a real actor. He's been in a number of very poor action films, as well as a very good film called 300. But he's been in a lot of rubbish. Anyway,
300. I saw that and I didn't like it.
Okay, so all right, so
okay.
Not everyone did, but I thought it was very good. Anyway, The point is, I heard a review by Mark Kerman of Greenland, and so Lorna and I just decided spontaneously to watch it. It's about the scenario is it's about this family who are dealing with an apocalyptic event, a meteor, or rather a series of meteors hitting the Earth. And we've all seen this before. I thought, oh, that sounds rubbish, because we've all seen it before with, Armageddon and Deep Impact, but it really is nothing like those films, and it's very, very good. I have to say, it is nerve-shreddingly tense and thrilling. It's one of the most thrilling films I've seen for a really long time. Completely immersive experience. So if anyone's looking to just escape the apocalyptic disaster that is COVID, you can watch a film about another apocalyptic disaster, Greenland. And also I watched Shrek last night with my family, which was, that was an escapist experience, but in a slightly different, more humorous way, I would say.
It's got... the donkey is very funny, isn't he? Eddie.
Yeah, Eddie Murphy.
That's it, Eddie Murphy.
Put you out of your misery there. So that was good. That's about the most interesting thing that's happened to me this week. I can't really think of anything else. How about you? Any news from?
I went to the dentist this morning. The dentist has reopened. That was exciting. Not very exciting actually.
Did you have to do various rituals in order to obtain
No.
You didn't.
No,
Did you have to wear a mask? No mask?
It was masked on the entrance, and then going up the stairs, and then into the room, and then obviously you take your mask off in order to be examined, because they can't examine you with a mask on.
Oh, you never know these days, Tom.
And but yeah, it was, they took your temperature, and then pretty much normal other than that.
Yeah.
And you can't wait inside at the moment, but there's not really any waiting room anyway, so it's not a bad thing. You sort of just turn up on time for your appointment and go on up. I could live with that.
Yeah, well, that sounds quite efficient, really, doesn't it?
Trips to the dentist are never very exciting. They never seem to have much to say about my teeth, which is a good thing. But it was something to do at least, hey.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Tom, this is presumably the kind of anecdote you're talking about that's going to drive the ratings up.
Yeah. Well. Other than that,
yeah,
not much happening.
Yeah,
I got my son's jabs today, so we're not really looking forward to those, because it means we have to wake up through the night to give him Calpol. Other than that,
I've got a little bit of feedback I wanted to read out to begin with, Tom, just because I feel quite bad about some dismissive comments I made about the book The Plague by Camus a couple of weeks ago. I should clarify this. I mean, this was my fault, because I was being dismissive of the book in the context of a quotation that was made do you remember I was talking about the lockdown skeptics debate, the Cambridge Union one? So I am sorry to have been so dismissive of this book. I have to say I did find it a slog, but I was reading it during the first lockdown, and so it probably wasn't the right time to read it. But I want to just read a little bit out from a couple of bits of feedback. So there was a wide outcry at my comments, which is why I feel like I must retract. So Ben, for example, writes and says he found very striking in the book that Camus says that the only way to fight the plague is with honesty or common decency. The lack of honesty is perhaps the most striking factor in how governments have dealt with COVID. The death counts we've been scared with, for example, are transparently false. In Australia, the premier of the most lockdown-happy state has said the virus, in inverted commas, doesn't discriminate, which is also plainly false, and so on and so on. By contrast, one of the heroes of the plague, the clerk Joseph Grand, works diligently to ensure accurate records are kept on the epidemic. While, as I understand it, Camus was an atheist, you could make a case that his heroes are loyal to the Tao that C.S. Lewis mentions in The Abolition of Man, or to the sense of fair play he talks about in Mere Christianity. They are aware of the natural law, even though they do not know its source. And Dr. Rea is the main character. Rea, I don't know how to pronounce his name, works for the good of others, careless for his own welfare, with a doggedness that saints might praise. Happily, I cannot imagine that Camus would have anything but harsh words for dissembling politicians like Boris, his cronies, and their counterparts around the world. I mean, I guess that's one of the central criticisms that I make of someone like Camus, is that he clearly has a strong moral sense, but being an atheist, he doesn't have any rational justification for it. Although he still says very strongly and explicitly in a novel like The Plague that you must obey your moral sense anyway, even though you do have no justification for it. Also, Rosemary writes in about La Peste. She says she really liked it for A-level and found it enthralling. So again, sorry, Rosemary, to have been so dismissive of it. And she says a number of things. One of the things she says is that I fail to emphasize that the book is an allegory where the plague stands for the Nazi occupation and the doctors the resistance. So I'll leave it there, but she goes into quite a bit of detail about that and why that's important. So I am sorry to have dismissed The Plague, La Peste, in the way that I did. I did see that it did have some literary quality, of course, but I was being too dismissive the other day, and apologies for all lovers of The Plague and Camus out there. I retract that particular dismissive comment. The other thing I'd like to just retract is that Rosemary also takes issue with the fact that I said that we wouldn't have anyone speak on the podcast who wasn't a monarchist. And she says, it's your podcast and you can invite or not invite whomever you like, but I can't see why an anti-monarchist should not be a sincere and forceful lockdown skeptic and a good Christian. The subject of monarchy doesn't have to come up after all. Indeed, Rosemary, and to anyone who's listening who thought I meant that seriously, that was just a joke. I haven't vetted our contributors for whether or not they approve of the monarchy. And indeed, in the situation that we're in at the moment, we're all in the trenches, aren't we, Tom? We can't be falling out over issues which really are secondary to the most important issues. So if you are anti-monarchist, or even if you're just agnostic about the monarchy, you are welcome on this show. Obviously, if you suit other criteria, and we're not just going to let anyone on, but that's definitely not. It's definitely not something we would exclude. Although I think we would draw the line at anti-monarchist rhetoric on the show. I don't know whether you agree with that, Tom.
Well, it depends. I mean, you can make some arguments about, I guess, how does the monarchy kind of function in the protection of the rights of the subjects of Her Majesty, and whether it's been doing that job,
right.
Which could get dangerously close to anti-monarchism if you're not careful.
Yeah, but I won't have anyone slagging off the Queen, though, Tom.
All right, okay.
That's where I draw the line. There will be no. Okay. I don't mind criticism of Prince Charles. And also, he's got
good archaeological taste. I mean, for all his problems,
has he?
Well, yeah. I mean, in as much as he calls out modern architecture for what it is, famously calling that the extension to the Chelsea pensioners' home a carbuncle on the side of an old friend. No, that was the National Gallery, wasn't it? Carbuncle on the side of.
Was that Prince Charles who said that?
Yeah, oh yeah, and his his work on modern houses that are drawing on sort of Georgian roots of sort of aesthetics, which everyone quite likes. And when it boils down to it, everyone would love to live in a sort of Georgian kind of home. That sort of neoclassical kind of the proportions are good. And the moving away from the sort of cardboard cutout housing estates that seem to pop up everywhere. Kind of good work he's doing in that. I mean, I mean, he's obviously other problems, but
but he's also trying to ban us all from eating meat, and he's assisting Klaus Schwab in the global Great Reset agenda.
Yeah, and I agree that
revolution.
I mean, to be honest, that'll stop once he's a monarch, won't it? Because he won't be able to. So I mean, at least he'll stop doing that.
Well, I hope so.
Okay, we should talk about.
Yeah. Sorry, we actually got sidetracked into a conversation about the monarchy, which is specifically what we said we weren't going to do. All right, go ahead, Tom. What are we talking about?
What are we talking about? Well, let's have a quick look at this week's sort of news so far. Where it's all been. We don't really want to
staring into the abyss this week, isn't it?
And I mean, it's this constant sort of will they, won't they unlock from the government. Now, obviously, next week they're going to be talking about their roadmap
on the 22nd.
On the 22nd.
Tom, I predict we're going to be both very depressed when we record next week's episode. That's my prediction.
And they've sort of been doing, it sounds like there's been a sort of expectation management going on for a couple of weeks coming up to that, which is irritating. The latest one, of course, is this sort of idea reported in the Telegraph that despite the successful vaccination program that should reduce hospitalizations and deaths already to a fraction of peak levels, the government are looking at not reopening, not stopping lockdown, not stopping telling people who they can and can't see and where they can and can't see them, which until there are only less than 1,000 infections a day. And I can only presume that's less than 1,000 new infections a day, because the idea of there only being 1,000 people with COVID would actually, would require about 10. Would require about 10 infections a day, which is if 1,000 is already a ridiculous target. We only really saw cases go that low in the very height of the summer last year, and that was when testing was at a fraction of the level that it is currently. So who knows how many cases there were really.
Yeah.
So whether we're ever going to get to that point, and that sort of, on the one hand, you get Hancock, who having said that he had booked his summer holiday and that we'd have to learn to live with the virus, and then on the other hand, the government says, but we're not actually going to learn to live with the virus, because let's be honest, 1,000 infections a day is actually fewer than even zero COVID. People are calling for. So let's just hope that was a government minister sounding off in an ignorant fashion, and that's not what they're hoping to do. Because and as we've said this before, if there can be a justification, and neither of us are convinced there can be a justification for this lockdown, its only justification is to protect the vulnerable whilst we vaccinate them. Once the vulnerable have been vaccinated, the 9 groups that the government have established as vulnerable, which is on target to happen reasonably soon, there can be no excuse for further restrictions of any sort, and that includes social distancing, that includes the rule of 6. The idea that the government can continue to tell us who we can and can't meet, and where and when we can and can't meet them is sickening. But and I sort of a bit of a thought experiment on a blog I read by Dr. No. I don't know if anyone's come across him. He's rather good. He's a GP, an ex-GP. He's worked in the NHS, worked out of it. And in the comments on one of his recent blogs, he basically points out that we are in a very similar situation right now as to where we were in the 1990s regarding the flu. And that we didn't have a widespread vaccination at that point, not a widespread vaccination program, and many more people died of it. And yet we didn't feel the need to lock down at that point. And we know that flu can be just as bad. And we also know that flu can do sort of vaccination escape. That's why they need to edit the vaccine every year. And we don't spend our whole lives locked down because of the potential of a flu strain that evades the vaccine. We just say, well, that was a bad flu year, and move on. Again, the same will be the case with COVID. Once it's over, but it's only over when everyone sort of says this is enough. Enough is enough.
The thing I don't understand about this, Tom, is it seems to me politically. I mean, for a start, it doesn't surprise me because I think this has been going on basically since the beginning. The 3 weeks to squash the sombrero thing. 3-week lockdown, in March 23rd, we'll have a 3-week lockdown. And here we are almost a year later and we're still in lockdown and it seems like it's going to go on forever. This is, this thing with the vaccines, it's just another thing to keep this thing going. The thing that I don't understand though is this seems politically like a really good opportunity for the government to hail the vaccine scheme as a success, to say comparatively we've beaten other nations in terms of the rollout of the vaccine, and also to get a jump on the rest of the world and restarting the economy, which is only going to be advantageous to start it sooner than other countries. So why, at this point, when we've got the best opportunity we've had, politically speaking, it's a golden opportunity. It's I totally disagree with this and I wouldn't see it like this, but I think the majority of the country would see it as a huge triumph for Boris and Matt Hancock. So it's a great opportunity for them politically, and it's a triumph for Brexit as well because the chaos in the EU. So why not, from a political perspective, really just go for it now? So the political perspective is there, the scientific and health perspective is there because surely if these vaccines have worked and these vulnerable groups have been vaccinated, then they're not at risk anymore. And the risk to everyone else is very, very, very low. So why on earth are they carrying on with this? Serious question.
And it's almost as if they forget every time that lockdowns have severe health consequences, not just now, but in the future as well, because poverty kills people. And driving the single biggest correlate between sort of life expectancy and anything else is strength of economy. Every day is costing us £1 billion extra debt. Is costing us all those livelihoods, all those businesses that are crumbling, and then the health problems and the mental health problems, especially for our children, that are on top of that. It's almost as if they're still, for some reason, allowing themselves to be guided by completely monomaniacal kind of scientists. And it's the government's job to take a wider view of what it means to prosper.
So do you think that that's why it is then? Do you think it's just that they're enthralled to these scientists and they can't, it's almost like they're under they're bewitched by Chris Whitty? And
well, I think at this point,
or what?
Yeah, I personally think it's more likely to be stupidity rather than culpability on the part of our government. But yes, I think they've forgotten that their job is, we spoke about this months ago, so their job is not to follow blindly the science, but to balance the science with with the other harms and to the economy and to health and livelihood.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, Tom. But the point I'm making is that they're not even following the science now, because even it's not even a plausible claim that they're following the science, because the science surely says that the vaccines have worked. This is the government's official narrative, isn't it? If the vaccines have worked and the vulnerable groups have been vaccinated, then it doesn't pose as much of a risk. And why therefore is it not the science? I'm trying to say the science therefore says that it's safe to open up again.
But I mean,
not following that science. So
they're not following that science. I mean,
what's the reason for it?
I mean, the reason is that I think there's a series of models that have been produced by the usual culprits that show that if we open up too quickly, even with the vulnerable vaccinated, we'd be back to the situation we were in January by the time we hit June.
How?
I don't know. I think it's. I mean,
people will be vaccinated who are vulnerable. So how could that be back in that situation?
Presumably, they're assuming that the sort of wide number of people who would catch it amongst the youth would lead to a surge of demand in health service. I think it's wrong. Well, not least because I think that that actually it was the spring that did most of the work, most of the heavy lifting last year anyway. This is quite easily shown because, let's be honest, by the time we hit July, we were pretty free to do what we liked. You could meet 30 people indoors legally. And people were doing that, and people were going to pubs and stuff, and it didn't. And we all know that exponential growth can happen very rapidly, and it didn't happen until it started kicking up in the autumn as things got colder and people were driven indoors. So I mean, to be honest, Jamie, they are following some very cautious scientists, and those very cautious scientists have nothing to lose by proclaiming doom if it's reopened, because as always, they don't. A overcautious model doesn't get castigated. All those models that demonstrated over Christmas that we would have 4,000 deaths a day. Some of them said before Christmas, which were used to scare the country into the November lockdown. Nowhere in the world has had 4,000 deaths a day. Not even Brazil at the height of the pandemic has had that many deaths a day from coronavirus. I mean, that's a country that's how many times bigger than us?
Yeah.
So they're not being ignored effectively, and they should be. That's the problem, Jamie. The people who are advising the government are locked into a narrative that it is only their proposed solutions that have thus far prevented awful things happening. And when you say, but look at Florida, but look at Sweden, but look at North Dakota and South Dakota, look at how there's been no second lockdown in Spain, but there has been, business closures. Why are these things working to contain it? They just shrug their shoulders.
Yeah. Are we the most fanatical country in the developed world? I mean, I think California is quite fanatical, isn't it? But are we the worst in terms of this maniacal obsession with safety?
I don't know, actually, Jamie. I think in terms of lockdown harshness, we've not had a lockdown as hard as some of the other European countries, but then most of them seem to have rode back from that sort of level of suppression. I mean, obviously, we were always allowed out of the house for whereas in Spain, for example, or France, you had to have travel documents to be out of the house outside of certain hours. We've never done that, but they didn't seem to do them much good.
Yeah, but we're in an indefinite lockdown. I mean, we've been. I mean, the tier 3 is a lockdown. There's no doubt about it. So my daughter was born 4 months ago, and we've been in lockdown since then. And they're talk, on the stuff that I was reading today, it was talking about, maybe in June being able to meet up with another household outside in June, in 4 months' time. That will be 8 months we've been in a lockdown. We've been arrested basically and told we can't leave our houses for 8 months, and only then we can meet people outside. I mean, this is absolutely insane. what's going on. I mean, the thing is we kind of get used to it, but when you actually it really hit me this week. I mean, last week we were kind of laughing and joking and having fun, and I think it's good to do that on the podcast because we have to lift our spirits. But I listened to a Planet Normal this week, and I listened to a bit of a James Delingpole and Laura Perring's episode, and when it sort of hits you what's going on, you just think that this is a moral travesty. I mean, I think it's for me personally, my family, I'm absolutely outraged that we've been locked in our house for months and months on end with no agency whatsoever, no political representation whatsoever. But you think about on Planet Normal, they had a listener who wrote in, and this person, it was a bloke who's talking about his wife. They had been refused medical care. This lady had she'd been having pains for several months, I think it was, and she wasn't allowed to be seen. They didn't check her out for anything. And then by the time she was she got so bad they had to take her to A&E. And by the time they actually started to examine her, they realized that she had advanced aggressive cancer. Right, and they've only now realised that, and they're only now treating it. And this is because of this insanity around a single virus, which is shutting down other sectors of healthcare, like cancer. Which is very, very serious and fatal for people. People are dying from this because of this obsession with this political obsession with COVID. And it's outrageous, Tom. It's a moral outrage. People are literally dying unnecessarily because of this. And they're talking about it going on till June, until we've got, cases of, what was it, under 1,000 a day. Why is that necessary? When the damage is so obvious.
Because they're not prepared to look at the damage, Jamie. They're not prepared to think about it. That see no evil, hear no evil sort of government. I think the other thing is I was thinking about this the other day. I was watching an episode of Time Team, and Time Team, one of my favourite programs. Those of you who haven't seen it, it's a gentle sort of Sunday evening archaeology program where Tony Robinson presents a team of archaeologists who go in and spend 3 days looking at a site, and they always
Baldrick.
Tony Robinson, Baldrick, and they always go and have a pint of beer in the local pub after the end of the hard day's digging. They talk about the finds and what they're hoping and expecting of the next day, and these sort of panoramic shots of crowded village pubs pulling pints of beer, and I almost welled up, Jamie, in tears. Yeah. And I thought, actually, we've got to stop thinking of that as a sort of old normal, but simply as normal, and what's going on here as abnormal. Far too many people say things like, I see that and I feel like I'm looking at a different world. No, you should see what is around you. And see that as the different world. Let's be honest. As I said earlier, we're in a sort of similar situation, in some ways, to the way the country was in the sort of early 90s, without a vaccination for the flu that was widespread. And if you had gone up to someone then and said, "Look, guys, we're going to lock you in your house for 6 months this year, but it's okay, it will save lives." Because, I mean, if lockdown works now, it would have worked then. It would have saved, they could have locked themselves down from October to May every year and saved a few 100,000 lives, most likely, if lockdown is effective. And they would have looked at you and said, that's laughable, In fact, as Tony Blair sort of sits there and carps from the sidelines, there's a wonderful article, which I was reading again on this in the comments under this Dr. No. I'll put the blog post up. I'm sure, but this is from the wonderful Bob Moran, and he says, "Dear Mr. Blair, thank you for joining us. I'd like to ask you about the greatest crisis you faced as Prime Minister. In the winter of 1999-2000, a huge number of people were tragically killed. They died from a totally out of control influenza virus letting rip across the country. The end result was a level of all-cause mortality which absolutely towers over what we saw during 2020's deadly pandemic. And indeed, it does tower over it." It says, "I can only imagine how stressful it must have been for you. Obviously, it goes without saying you considered a national lockdown. I mean, it's so obvious that they save lives. And obviously, you considered mandatory face masks. I mean, the science is clear. Obviously, you considered investing billions in vaccine development, had the NHS managers and staff on the telephone in floods of tears every day, screaming they're at breaking point. How you must have agonized over what to do. How would we grieve as a nation? How would our children come to terms with the fact that they had murdered their grandparents by hugging them? Would we ever let them forget it?
Yeah.
But please, if you could, Mr. Blair, talk us through your decision-making process. How precisely did you reach the eventual conclusion that the right course of action was to do absolutely bugger all, to totally ignore the whole thing, and have a giant party instead?
Yes.
And it comes with a picture of Blair et al. Doing the Auld Lang Syne at the Millennium Dome, crowded together. And, that was a rational way of looking at that. And if you go and have a look at those ONS statistics, we looked at them a couple of weeks ago. 1999-2000 was an awful year for deaths.
Yeah.
And we're not even anywhere near it at this point. Nowhere near it.
Well, Blair is just typical of this class of politician and person, you've got to say, that wants to use this situation in order to further a pre-existing agenda. So, he tried to bring in ID cards, I think it was in 2004. That might be the wrong year, but he tried to bring in ID cards and failed, thank goodness. And now he just sees this as another opportunity to expand the reach of the state into the private lives of the citizens of this nation by introducing vaccination passports or whatever they're called. Now, I have to say on this issue, Tom, of vaccination passports, I did receive an email from my MP because I signed a petition against this, and she said that they were debated in the House of Parliament on I think it was December 14th, and the idea was rejected, and the vaccinations minister said it wasn't going to happen. So that to a certain extent reassured me, but I could quite easily see something like this happening. Daniel French wrote an article this week about the possibility of this kind of vaccination passport by the back door type thing happening. So this is also very worrying. And in this article, Daniel was talking about the church and the church's response to this, because if it becomes the case in society that you can't go, for example, to the cinema or a pub or a restaurant unless you've got a vaccination passport, the church cannot join in with that, and say to people that they can't come into the church unless they've got some kind of some kind of QR code or something like that. I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous.
And there are far too many places where you can imagine it being brought in as well. I agree with you, Jamie. I think the moment you start, my worry is actually not that the government will bring in a vaccine passport, but that they won't do anything about the de facto vaccine passport that will turn up anyway. As a company says, as a company requires its employees to get vaccinated, or yes, the cinema needs it,
yeah.
And you end up with a sort of public coercion. Or even, you're forced to. And, I'm not really able to say where I heard this, but, I was surprised to hear a number of people saying to me the other day, I wish Boris was a bit stronger and just made the vaccination mandatory. And I said, are we really, are we really in a position as a country where we want to make medical procedures compulsory? I mean, can people not see quite how troubling that is? That is literally the sort of thing that the totalitarianistic Russia and China, and dare I even say it, the sort of the Nazi government used to do. It is not the sort of thing that a democracy that has any self-respect allows, whether allows private companies to do it or allows the state to do it. And the government could come out against it quite happily. They could say, this is wrong. We're not, we're not really going to allow this to happen, in much the same way that other discrimination is not allowed by the state. Yeah. But the question is whether they will or won't.
Yeah, it's just madness, isn't it? I mean, it just shows you how. I mean, I do think that one of the reasons that this has been able to happen is because people in our nation don't have a sense of our nation's history and what we, of our actual values. I mean, talk about British values or whatever. The values that we've stood up for in the past are values like freedom, democracy, justice, the rule of law, and things like that, all of which have been utterly transgressed by this new ideology. And like, the interlocutors you were just talking about, Tom, it's like they've never even considered that these are British values. You know what I was thinking about the other day, before all this madness, when there was a terrorist attack, what people used to say is, we can't change our way of life at all, because if we change our way of life, we give into fear, and then the terrorists have won. Do you remember when people used to say that? We must continue to go to Ariana Grande concerts. We must continue to live our lives in a free and British way, which we're proud of, and which we're not going to allow to be compromised by terrorism, right? So that's what we used to say, and that was right. That was right. That was right. We shouldn't change our way of life because we're scared of terrorists, because that's what they want us to do. And also that's their goal. They want to destroy our society. They want to destroy our way of living. And yet when a virus comes along, we're willing to absolutely transfigure our whole society into what is basically a police state. We're talking about mandatory vaccination, vaccinating people against their will. I mean, honestly, this is a complete reversal of all of those values that we were talking about. So, I just don't know what to make of it.
I mean, it goes without saying, Jamie, that freedom is something that is worth sacrificing an awful lot for. And in the World War II particularly, we sacrificed vast amounts of money, our entire empire, our prosperity, our way of life, in order to preserve the freedom of countries and our own country across the world. I think I got very angry last year on VE Day, which was where it was bitterly ironic, because we had at the same time a sort of celebration of that sacrifice for freedom that had been been given by many of those people quite willingly, and at the same time claiming that our freedom was so disposable that you can just throw it away over COVID. And how on earth can we now talk to any totalitarian country and say, we think you ought to allow protests when we've banned them in the name of public health? How can we talk to anywhere that sort of puts its citizens under arbitrary house arrest when we've done exactly the same thing?
Yeah.
Whereas, how can we preserve any values on the world stage when we've just sacrificed them in a pursuit of safety, which is inherent in freedom is a risk. Inherent in freedom is a risk.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we've completely surrendered any kind of moral high ground that we imagined we had. I mean, arguably we didn't have it anyway for several reasons, but any sort of ostensible moral high ground we had, in terms of our values as a free nation. I mean, it was outrageous, wasn't it? In VE Day, I remember seeing a self-congratulatory tweet that Boris Johnson or one of his cronies put out of him lighting a candle at Westminster Abbey. By the way, he told us all to stay at home, and under no circumstances leave the house, but he left to go to Westminster Abbey and light a candle to commemorate all the people who died for the freedom of this nation. I mean, while everyone is under house arrest. I mean, does he not see the irony in that action? Tom, I want to share with you something that I wrote this week as like a kind of argument against lockdown. And I did it partly because I listened to this talk radio debate between Peter Hitchens and Dan Hodges, which you didn't get to listen to, did you?
No.
But it was an interesting discussion, but I felt the way that it was moderated basically was a little bit kind of intrusive. Like the discussion didn't really flow as it could have done. And really, I mean, Peter Hitchens, I mean, he's very, very solid on this stuff. Dan Hodges was, I just felt really, really pathetic, really. I mean, he's obviously changed his mind since the beginning, where he was clearly at least skeptical of these lockdowns, but now he's advocating for them. And his principal reason appears to be that maybe some people were predicting the second wave wouldn't happen, or it wouldn't be as bad, but it has happened, so therefore we need a lockdown, which just is a complete logical non sequitur. And also, again, he's doing this thing where he's saying, oh well, it's fine because we've got the vaccine and soon we'll be out of this, and that therefore it's justified. So it was very lame on his part. He was just saying the same thing over and over again. One thing I did find funny though is he kept on calling Pete Hitchens a lockdown denier, and Pete Hitchens sort of tried to argue the case for why he shouldn't use this language, but then Hodges kept saying it every single time he made a statement, which was quite funny because it was clearly winding Pete Hitchens up. But I wanted to share with you, I was thinking this through, and I think that it is, to my mind, it is absolutely clear that there is no rational justification for what's going on. And I wanted to kind of just write something formal for why. And basically my argument, if I were in a debate, which let's face it, I'm not, because you're the only person who I ever talk to about this stuff and you agree with me. But if anyone asked me to do a debate, I would say that the reason we shouldn't be doing this is because in order for this to be morally justified or politically justified or whatever, at least four things need to be true all at the same time. They all must be true, and it must be obvious to some degree that they're true. If any one of these things is false, then what's going on is an absolute disaster, right? So these four things, just briefly. So firstly, COVID must be an existential threat to a significant proportion of humanity and to the infrastructure of society, which you could include like the collapse of the NHS or whatever. So the threat must not be significantly exaggerated. So that's the first thing. And just bear in mind, all of these need to be true at the same time. So even if that's true, it doesn't necessarily justify what's happening. So that's the first one. Secondly, the measures that are being suggested must be effective and demonstrably effective. So not only must it be true that lockdowns do work, but it must be demonstrable that they work. Otherwise, why would you do them if you don't know if they work or not? You wouldn't do this on a whim, right? Number three, the measures suggested must be more effective than less harmful measures that purport to achieve the same or similar results. Now that's important because you remember we're talking about that lockdown debate where basically this doctor who's arguing for the lockdown said people were imposing their own lockdowns before the first lockdown, and that was working, right? So that would be an example of a measure which is less damaging, but nevertheless still works. Okay, so that's number three. The measures suggested must be more effective. So the lockdown, the government mandated lockdown must be more effective than less harmful measures that purport to achieve the same or similar results. Again, you could look at Sweden and see.
And I think you should probably finesse it even slightly more, that the increase in effectiveness must be greater than any increase in harms.
Yes. Well, that actually, I mean, that goes with my fourth point, which is that the measures suggested must prevent more damage than the damage that they cause. And again, this must be demonstrably the case. Is that pretty much what you're saying?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So that's again, I mean, that to me is the most obvious one, which is so obviously false. Whatever damage that's being prevented by these lockdowns. So firstly, we don't even know that any damage is, but any damage that is being prevented by them is so vanishingly unlikely to be greater than the amount of damage that these lockdowns are clearly doing. There is demonstrable, empirical, overwhelming evidence that these lockdowns are literally killing people and causing enormous human misery, the breakdown of the entire infrastructure of society, all of our values, all of our institutions, all of our mediatory institutions. The damage is incalculable. The economy, I mean, the damage is incalculable.
And as Lord Sumption pointed out again yesterday, to the very concept of liberal democracy, which has thus far allowed us to flourish over the years, and presumably if allowed to continue, will continue to allow us to flourish. Nothing has brought more people out of poverty and into greater quality of life than liberal democracy. It's not perfect, but that is, I think, uncontroversial. And yet this definitely goes to it is a casualty of COVID, or of our response to COVID, I should say.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction. Yeah, so basically, just to summarize my argument, if any one of these four things are wrong, so one or more of these things are wrong, and I would say they definitely are, even if any of these four things is in doubt, the measures should not be used, because to actively inflict certain damage upon human beings is much worse than allowing human beings to be endangered by potential damage. And the illustration I would give there is, if you're in a train, right, and you're going down the train tracks, and you think you see 7 people ahead of you, right? You think you see 10 people ahead of you. So you're not sure, but you think maybe there's a fog or something like that. You know, if you turn off, you're definitely going to kill 7 people, right? The rational thing to do in that situation, or the moral thing to do in that situation, is not to definitely kill 7 people. It's to carry on along the track and hope that there's nobody there, and hope that your perception of what's ahead is wrong. And that's the analogy I'd use here, because if you turn off, you're definitely going to kill 7 people, right? But if you carry on, you may kill nobody. And that's the option that we closed down to begin with. We said we can't act as though this isn't a massive deal because of the consequences if we don't. But we could have kept society open, mitigated the damage that these measures might have caused, and still had a rate of damage from COVID which is similar to the one we have at the moment, like in Sweden, for example. So anyway, that maxim, I think, is self-evidently true. Carry on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you'd be really interested by an article that David Patton's written in Spiked, saying we do not need lockdown to keep COVID under control. And he makes some of the points you made there, but he also makes the point that people are effectively, very good at self-preservation. We were built, to a long degree to self-preservation. If and people will act consummately to the preservation of themselves, and also, I would say, because we are social beings, and to the society around them. So if you lived with your grandmother, for example, and you knew that COVID was around and doing a lot of damage to people like her, you would be much more likely to act cautiously than if you were a family, sort of a group of 20-somethings living in a shared accommodation in London, to whom COVID is virtually not a risk. And this is one of the reasons he says that lockdowns is less effective than maybe assumed, is because when you lock both lots down, well, the one that was actually at risk, the chances are they'd have locked themselves down, which, no one here is going to argue that we shouldn't take precautions. If you live with your 97-year-old granny who's got COPD, you're not going to take the same levels of risk as if you are 22 and in student digs.
Yeah.
And yet, when you lock both down, you don't actually change the risk for either, because there was virtually no risk to the 22-year-olds anyway, and the person living with their 97-year-old gran wasn't going to act in a risky behaviour anyway. Yeah. So there's less certain kind of benefits than you'd have thought. Anyway, that's on Spiked. I'll email you the link, Jamie.
Thank you. I mean, so basically that's my argument. I think the burden of proof is definitely on people who would want these measures, and I think the burden of proof is absolutely unbearable, because I don't think you can prove any of these things. Ultimately, you might be able to show that COVID is an existential threat to a significant proportion of humanity and to the infrastructure of society. You might be able to demonstrate that. I'm very unconvinced that that's true. I don't understand, for example, why the NHS has not been able to prepare over the last year for this second wave. So
no, that's an interesting one. But it's also kind of, even if we just go back and look at the worst pandemic in the 20th century, the 1918 flu, was that it was dreadful, but it wasn't an existential threat to society. We know that because society continued pretty much as normal, and then you had the 20s afterwards, which were a noted period of boom time. So 1918 pandemic of flu was pretty awful, and loads of people died, but it wasn't an existential threat to anyone. I mean, it killed a lot more younger people than COVID does. and yet still was not an existential threat to
Yeah.
society. Society continued, the structures continued. Some people were very unlucky, other people were more lucky. The government isn't there to make sure that we're not all, tucked up in bed.
Yeah.
It's not there to make sure we're all completely safe. But then even going back to some of the really huge epidemics of the 19th and earlier centuries, they weren't existential threats to society, because in the end, again, society continued, evolved, moved forward, and they were forgotten about.
Yeah, until recently.
In general, I don't think we'll be talking about COVID in 3 years' time. We'll be doing other things. We've got better things to be doing.
That strikes me as incredibly optimistic, Tom.
I will not be talking about COVID.
I hope not. I really hope not. The point about my argument is that even if it were the case that were true, you would still need to demonstrate that the measures are effective, that they are comparatively effective, compared with other potential measures, and that they are proportionate, so that they would have to prevent more damage than they cause. So even if it were true that it is an existential threat, it would still be the burden of proof would still be upon the person arguing for it to show that the measures that are being suggested are meet those other criteria. So I don't think there's any way you could possibly demonstrate that. And so I think that these lockdowns are, they're demonstrably they're demonstrably irrational. There is no way that you can possibly justify what's going on. And if you look at a country like Sweden, it's so obvious that is a far more rational and humane and moral response than what we're doing. I mean, one of the things I think, is that, when we talk about the damage that's being done, that's most of the time we only focus on the damage that's being done right now. But as you rightly say, this is going to fundamentally alter the political nature of our society, so that we live in a far more authoritarian society. You can already see, somebody like Matt Hancock. He's just got a taste of this power, and it's like he's drunk on it. Like we were talking about last week. He's talking about throwing people in prison for 10 years for filling a form incorrectly. It's just power does this to people. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, as George Orwell says. This is a fact of history. Just read history. This happens all. Why when the proletariat takes over, what happens? Are they benign? Do they treat their inferiors with justice and mercy and equality? No, they go absolutely crazy, and they start killing people, and they build gulags, and they start separating parents from their children and throwing them in prison for no reason, for saying something out of line about the party. This is the lesson of history. It happens over and over and over again. If you give people power, it goes to their heads. So this is why, with someone like Dan Hodges, when he's saying really complacently, oh, they'll just put things back to normal, and then we'll never go back to the lockdown, and everything will be the same as it was. That's just naive. It's naive, because we've given them this power, and there is no reason to think that they'll want to give it back at all. They'll want to hold on to it. And, to return to our discussion earlier, where we were asking, why are they doing this? I think that is the only reasonable explanation, is that the power has become habitual. They've become habituated to the power, and now they can't give it up. They probably don't even know that they're doing it. The power has become endemic in government, and now they want to keep exercising it. So it's a really serious problem. And, even this is why I'm so pessimistic about this from a political perspective. Even once these measures have been relaxed, say they're relaxed significantly in 6 months or 9 months' time, this could easily happen again next year, or it could happen in 18 months' time.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the problems, and I guess it's to do with that proportionality question. We have a constantly changing definition of what the lockdown is for. So, I mean, quite aside from anything else, originally it was to protect the NHS, and then it was to, just keep going really for a bit in the summer, and then November was again to protect the NHS, and then again to protect the NHS, and again, but
mostly to protect the NHS.
But now suddenly the goalposts have been shifted quite dramatically from protect the NHS, because it doesn't need protecting. Did even in London. Now we know that London peaked under tier 4, not under the new lockdown, and even tier 4 was sort of considerably. You were allowed outside, as as I understand it, without a reasonable excuse. And you're allowed to meet people socially outside, but both of which are kind of nice things to be able to do. I mean, so the question is whether any of the additional stuff has ever been needed. I think, but the problem with lockdown is that they as they change the goalposts from protect the NHS to keep cases down to stop variants, you end up at a point where you can't get out of it. You're never going to be at a point where we can't be certain that variants won't happen. It's not going to, isn't it? So therefore, under that logic, and that's pretty much the only logic that's keeping it going now, under that logic, we're not going to get out. Yeah. Because, and why can't we treat it much like the flu, in which, presumably there's always a danger of vaccine-resistant flu viruses turning up. That's why they have to change the vaccine every year. But, it's not the end of the world, is it?
Well, we used to think that it wasn't, but I don't know what the future will bring. Tom, should we do a little bit of listener feedback? I think we've had a bit of a good rant there. I mean, I do find it really helpful to talk, I have to say, and a number of people email in and say that they actually find hope and encouragement from these podcasts, which is great. It is a soothing balm to be able to rant into my microphone to you. I'd like to read out. So, do you remember Rosemary emailed in last week and with the rewriting of the New Testament to
that's right, yeah,
the new Covidian religion. So she's drafted now a set of beatitudes. She says for the new religion. Here we go. Got them here. So, blessed are the snitches, for they shall denounce everyone his neighbour. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be graciously permitted to witness the funeral on Zoom. Blessed are the meek, for they shall obtain every restriction that is imposed on them, be it ever so absurd. Blessed are they which do order all things upon Amazon, for their orders shall be fulfilled. Blessed are the vaccinated, for they shall obtain a second dose, though not necessarily of the same vaccine. Blessed are the socially distanced, for they know well that the virus thriveth on human contact. Blessed are the quarantined, for they are imprisoned without charge or trial, for the good of all. Blessed are they that persecute those who wear no face masks, for theirs is a totalitarian heaven. So thank you very much for that, Rosemary. It's a little bit of light relief to keep us going. Do email any future revisions to the Holy Scriptures that you come up with. Another email from Simon. So he emailed before. He was the chap we thought lived in Brussels, but he actually doesn't live in Brussels, but he was just there for some work. He writes, he wants to thank us for our continued work of excellence in the Irreverend podcast. You hear that, Tom? Excellence. Probably talking mostly about, well, probably both of us, let's be fair. Many times over the past months, various nightmare scenarios have loomed large in my mind. The worst of these by far is the spectre of Chris Whitty as my insecure and domineering father. I hope and trust that you will issue an apology for the offence and upset you have caused your listeners with this quite reckless use of language. I do apologise if the image of Chris Whitty as your father was too disturbing to any listeners. On a lighter note, I find it rather wonderfully ironic that, as an atheist of many years standing, your voices have brought me as much solace, encouragement, and hope than anyone else. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Your clear reasoning and wonderful sense of humour shine like a beacon from within the cacophonous clamour of a panicking populace and a floundering administration. Lovely sentence there, Simon. I empathise completely with your frustrations at the shortcoming of online church services. The absurdity of the premise that somehow a remote online experience is an acceptable substitute for the experience of receiving the sacrament in person is manifest. If denying its efficacy is denying God's Holy Spirit, then keep denying. The ghastly online cultural events that have happened are similarly pale imitations of a genuine theatrical experience. Our education system's provision of online lessons are likewise no real substitute for a genuine education. And I know from bitter experience that trying to attend a course to become a qualified cricket umpire is really difficult when you're stuck in an apartment in Brussels with a dodgy Wi-Fi connection and an inability to watch the LBW videos. Well, it does sound difficult. Since returning home a week ago, I suppose back to the UK, I've detected a change in the air, not for the better. I've witnessed I witnessed a horrible row about masks between two women in Sainsbury's, seen more young people wearing masks on the street, and been challenged aggressively about my own failure to wear a face covering. I have heart failure and therefore a medical exemption, but was told in Sainsbury's that that doesn't make any difference. Please continue your good work. It is vital we start the push for getting back to a semblance of normality before we forget what normal is. Best wishes, Simon. That's thanks so much, Simon. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it, Tom, that this man is an atheist and yet he can see how ridiculous it is to suggest that you can have church online. Mm. If only all Christians realize that as well, Simon.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were you going to say, Tom?
No, I mean, just any training. I've done plenty of training online now, and it's deeply unsatisfying, isn't it? There's something wearying about it. It's
it's tiring, isn't it?
It's it's much more tiring than normal training, mostly because it's so dull.
Yeah. Tom, what I found on Zoom is it's okay when you're talking loads, right? So when it's you and me.
Sorry, Jamie, 1 second.
Okay. You okay? Yeah, no, what I was going to say is it's okay when you're talking on Zoom, I think, because it kind of keeps you ticking over. It's when you're watching a Zoom meeting where you're not really saying anything, it just absolutely frazzles my brain. I can't do it for very long without completely losing any attention. And the other thing as well is when you do have a meeting, you realize how limited it is, because in a normal room, if you have several people there, there's all the kind of, the sort of body language and the subconscious signals and the way that you can kind of respond in a complex way to the various sort of cross currents that are going on in conversation in the room. And you just can't do that with a Zoom meeting, because it's so limited and static. You have to pick up from what somebody has just said. You can't really interrupt. You can't interject. You can't sort of go off on a tangent and come back. It's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. It's completely different from. I mean, generally, if I'm really honest, I don't really learn much from group kind of lessons anyway. It's just not. The lectures are all right. I found my notes.
It's because you already know it all, Tom.
That is true, Jamie. But I found my notes from my Oxford degree, and it's about 3 pages of it. Yeah. And anything that's interesting enough to be remembered was remembered, and everything else was just discarded anyway. So
exactly.
Anyway.
Take that, Oxford, with your information. Right, so we do one more email. This is quite a long one, so let's do this one, and then I know you need to go. Okay, so this is from Ben, who's emailed the show before, but I thought I'd just read this out because it's nice. He says, in the several episodes he's listened to since he last emailed, one of the things that struck him greatly is, I'll just read this. One of the things that struck me greatly is your message of hope. Hope in Jesus is a particular thing, but hope from any source right now is immensely valuable. It is easy and crushing to think that things are getting worse and will only continue to do so until finally you die, which will be the final defeat. Even in the people I know who are against lockdowns, I do see an impulse to despair now, to stop resisting, because as one friend of mine said recently, I just want my life back. Despair is the enemy's name, I counter. In a Christian context, that seems to have a special resonance. Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that. We must not despair. Continuing on. On Christmas Eve, I went to midnight mass at an Anglican church here. So Ben lives in Thailand. Went to midnight mass at an Anglican church here. It's the first time I took myself to church in nearly 25 years. I went the following Sunday too, and then by the next Sunday, following another COVID outbreak, the church closed again. In the pamphlet for the service, there was a notice that said something like, all baptized Christians are welcome to take communion. I had taken notice of the discussions of spiritual preparedness to receive the Eucharist on the podcast, and also of a comment that Jesus tells us what we should do, so why not take the fast train? I think that was the analogy from Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis. It was one of the reasons I'd wanted to go to church again, not out of a desire for speed, of course, but to do what we have been asked and to accept what Jesus has offered. The welcome message in the book meant a huge deal to me, as have your own words of welcome on the podcast. So I said the I'm not worthy prayer, humbled myself before God, and took communion again for the first time in many years. I've been disappointed in the way the church has responded to COVID. When the church I decided to try attending closed just after Christmas, I figured it was because the government had banned religious gatherings. I'd read something to this effect in the news. The vicar issued a letter that said he was keen for us all to meet again in person when we can. And the church community has put a lot of effort into producing a compelling online service for Sundays, which I've appreciated. I'm also sympathetic to the concerns of some of the congregation. A couple of weeks after the church had shut, our nanny, who is Filipino and attends Baptist churches, mentioned she was off to church on Sunday. She said she didn't think the church was banned, and I found that the first Catholic church I looked up is still running in-person services, though the cathedral is closed. So I'll probably go to a Catholic church for a while, and then I might return to the Anglican one when it opens again. And then he goes on to talk about his experience of being in church and his reflections on the fact that the church is closed voluntarily. And he says it very nicely, but there's clearly a sense of disappointment and frustration. And he writes, even if churches have capitulated to fear or timidity, God endures. The scriptures endure. I can still try to follow Jesus. And it is heartening to know that there are clergy like yourself who are doing a standout job in representing the way, the truth, and the life. I've also come across the idea a few times in the past year that suffering can lead people to God. I've talked about this many times with a Buddhist friend who has been in very poor health recently, about how our meditation practice has often been best when things are bad in life. And I'm grateful, at least, that the crime of lockdowns has played a part in calling me back to God. But what a terrible price it is for the world to pay that some might hear that call. Even if this is God's will, I feel bound to wish it could have happened in some other way. And I do think there's a missed opportunity. If churches close their doors at this time, if they have some way not to, I can't be the only one who's wanted to come back. Thanks for reading again. I hope you and your family surviving lockdown okay, and you're drawing strength and joy from your work. So it's a lovely email. So thanks very much, Ben. I wanted to read that at some length. I've had to cut some of it out. But one of the things there, Tom, is you can see a similar thing in this country. The Church of England, for some reason, seems to think that the best thing to do is to close down the church buildings and have online church. But you can see here, with people who have found or are seeking Christ in the darkness of this situation, the effective thing to do is not to close your church and have online church services. It's to have your churches open so that people can actually come and receive the word, receive the sacrament if it's appropriate. And you can see here how Ben has been literally shut out from his church because they shut it down just after he's come and received communion for the first time in 25 years. Sorry, carry on.
Absolutely, and I know people across the country feel the same way. Actually, what he was saying about the Catholic Church resonates with some people I know who have found that whilst their local Anglican church isn't open, the Catholic Church is, and so they've been able to go and receive, if not the sacraments, because they're not Catholic, at least spend some time worshipping in the presence of the body of Christ, corporate body of Christ on earth. So yeah,
I mean, it is amazing, really. I think that that we're going down this path of closing our churches down as much as we possibly can. I know you have to go in a minute, Tom, but it's worth mentioning the Spectator article as well, which is written by the two archbishops. It's quite funny because they're obviously annoyed about people in the press, such as our good friend Daniel French and Marcus Walker and Giles Fraser, who've been criticising them. And they basically write a kind of defence of the church and what the church has been doing. And it finishes by saying, there are rascally voices around who want to undermine the church. It was ever thus. But the real story is that we so believe in that vision of serving every inch of the country and every person in it that we're having to expand what it is to be the church. The whole article is available on Spectator.
Expanding what it means to be the church into realms where it doesn't mean church. Yes.
Expanding it so it's so diffuse that it literally doesn't mean anything. But I thought it was quite funny that Daniel has in effect been called a rascal by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So well done, Daniel. It's good you've got a job. We have to ask what he thinks about that.
Yeah. Well, pride. I'd be quite proud of that. So, I mean, we're probably rascals as well, Jamie.
Oh, come on! He's not heard our podcast, has he?
Well, you never know.
Well, maybe you don't know. You don't know whose homes you're invading with these recordings. But I mean, I'd be very proud of myself if the Archbishop of Canterbury had even heard of this podcast. Well, I don't know. Proud is the right word, but I'd be surprised. Let's say.
Well, I mean, I think we better bring this to a close now, Jamie. But I mean, I'm really encouraged by Ben's letter actually, and he reminds us actually maybe there has been some doom and gloom this week. The news isn't good coming from the government, but that's not the good news in this world. So we can take heart that this will end, but more importantly than just this ending and us, getting out and doing stuff again, the essential truth of Christ remains, and that should give us heart at all times. So here I am with the prophet on one side and the law on the other of my shoulders, just reminding everyone that Christ reigns on high.
Absolutely. And also it's worth saying as well that if people do want to find a church, we have a friend of the show, Andy, who's got a website which lists open churches during the lockdown, which is uklockdownchurches.wordpress.com. So you can just go on there and have a look if you're looking for an open church, or indeed list your own church on there. But that is quite a good list, expanding all the time. So and I have to say as well, Tom, in the correspondence and with other people I know outside of the show, I know quite a few people who have found open churches and gone to them for the first time during this lockdown. So it's definitely worth looking for churches which are open if you're seeking to worship with the body of Christ in person, for sure. But you're quite right, Tom. We have to hold on to the message of the gospel and the hope of the gospel, don't we? Even in the bleakest times. And next week, of course, we may be in the darkest period for a long time after the announcement on the 22nd of February, which I think we're both anticipating is not going to be the news that we want to hear, but we shall see.
Well, God bless everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye now.
Goodbye.